This is Joe Galloway conducting an oral history interview with Mr. Craig M. Loftin on October 22nd, 2019 at 8:30 a.m. We're located at the main office of the United States of America Vietnam War Commemoration in Arlington, Virginia. Sir, before we begin, could you please state and spell your first and last name for the transcriber?
Yes, it's Craig Loftin, first name spelled K-R-E-I-G, Loftin, L-O-F as in Frank, T-I-N.
Thank you. Before we talk about your time in Vietnam, I'd like to get a little biographic information. When and where were you born?
I was born in Central Valley of California in 1947.
Who were your family members?
Mother and father, brother and sister.
What'd your dad do?
My dad was a petroleum engineer, worked in the oil field business for 35 years.
Wow. And where did you grow up and go to school? What do you consider your hometown?
My hometown is Bakersfield, California.
Wow.
Everybody says, I know where Bakersfield is. I've been through it.
Yeah, right. What somebody said, Bakersfield looks like it was flung from a speeding car.
Yeah, that's probably an accurate description.
How did you come to enter the military?
I blame John F. Kennedy and Ernest Hemingway. As a young boy, I read everything Hemingway had to write, and so I developed a wanderlust at a very young age, wanting to explore the world. And in my sophomore year of high school, Kennedy was killed, and of course his speech about ask not what your country can do for you resonated with me, so I became fascinated with Vietnam and actually spent a lot of my free time at the library reading the Washington Post and the LA Times. In the early 65 or something like that, the wave had not turned against the war, so it was, most of the reporting was positive, that we were helping our neighbors, and so I had a pretty good better understanding than most of my friends, I think.
So you went down to the Marine recruiter and signed up?
I did. I went down there and I said, I'm here because I want to fly helicopters. And he looked up at me and said, what are you, 12? And I said, no, I'll be 18 in July. And so he said, well, what kind of a student are you? And I said, average. I'm a strong C student. He says, well, we need guys flying helicopters that have a little bit of intelligence, and I don't see it happening for you. Which was disappointing. 5 minutes, he already had me pegged.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I got up in a huff and decided, well, he said, you can go next door to the Army. They're hiring kids right out of high school to fly Hueys. I said, I'm not going into the Army. I'm going into the Marine Corps. And I'm sure I told him I was the best recruit to probably walk through those doors. Got up to leave, and he walked over and put his arm around me like a long-lost uncle and started whispering in my ear, I've got a better job for you than flying helicopters. You ever heard of a crew chief? And I said, no. He goes, well, he's in charge of everything after the cockpit, and I need crew chiefs. So he talked me into signing up for another year of enlistment because aviation required 4-year commitment. So I gladly did that. Young and naive.
Yeah. Where'd they send you for basic?
MCRD San Diego.
San Diego. And where did you go after that?
Well, after that, at that time, you left. Well, the Marine Corps, everybody's a rifleman.
Right.
So we went to advanced infantry training at Camp Pendleton as soon as we graduated and spent 30 days there learning how to be a grunt. Tried to talk my way into becoming a grunt, and one of my instructors said, no, you don't want to be a grunt. You stay with helicopters. So he talked me into staying with my designated MOS. And shortly thereafter, I went to Millington, Tennessee for aviation school, jet school, theory of flight and all that before going to the fleet.
Now, this is helicopter training.
Yes.
Now, explain what the crew chief does, what he's
Well-
got to know.
Well, in the Marine Corps, every helicopter that lifts off has to have a pilot, a co-pilot, and a crew chief on board. The theory of why the crew chief needs to be there is if it gets shot down or develops a mechanical failure of some kind, the crew chief has a better chance than the pilot and co-pilot at correcting whatever mechanical problems there are. So it's mandatory that each aircraft have a crew chief on board.
And that he knows the mechanics
Yeah.
to some greater extent.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to do anything with a major jet engine problem, but if there's a fitting on hydraulics that's leaking, you can take a wrench and correct that and hopefully
I've
get out
never
of
been
the
on a
LZ.
Marine helicopter where the hydraulics weren't leaking.
Yeah, that's right. The bubble chasers, we call
Yeah.
those guys.
Okay, so you finished the crew chief school.
And I went to HMM 261 in New River, North Carolina. New River is a part of Camp Lejeune,
Right.
and it's. I had no idea that 261 at that time was considered a training squadron, and we had just received a new aircraft from the Navy called CH-46, which is a tandem rotor aircraft built by Boeing Vertol, and it was replacing the old work dog CH-34.
The shuddering shithouse.
Yes, that's right. And so, like all new aircraft introductions, there was some mechanical problems and pilot errors and things like that that created some crashes. So all the 34 guys go, "Oh, you couldn't pay me to fly a CH-46." Of course, that was my baby, and I was promoted to crew chief at 19 years of age. I think I was probably one of the youngest crew chiefs at that time. And of course, I
what
wanted
kind
to,
of missions were you flying at this point?
at this time, it was just, primarily training co-pilots on how to maneuver the aircraft, touch and go, hovering into LZs and things like that. But I glommed onto a CH-34 crew chief who had just come back from Vietnam. And of course, that would have been 1966, so it was a different war than when I was there in 68. But I wanted to learn absolutely everything there was to learn about flying in and out of hot LZs. And so, he was a pretty scruffy guy. His fingers were always dirty, and he was just biding his time to get out, but he was a fount of information. He was just incredible. And I asked him, I was pestering him with questions, and he said, "Craig, look, I can't tell you everything that's going to happen to you in Vietnam because there's going to be things that happen that I just have no idea. So I'm going to give you a piece of advice that somebody gave me, and I want you to learn this. I want you to learn how to keep your mind calm in all circumstances." And that was the greatest bit of advice I had ever been given. And it's a good piece of advice for pilots, co-pilots, anybody, no matter what the situation is, try to remain calm because that increases your chances of survival.
Indeed. But when did you get orders to Vietnam?
And well, an interesting thing happened. My sister's squadron was HMM 262, and they were right next to us at New River, and they had received orders as a squadron to leave in December of 1966. So I waved goodbye to them, and that ramped up my efforts to try to volunteer for Vietnam. I felt like that's where I needed to be, so I kept pestering my CO until finally he issued me orders to Vietnam. And so that was in July of 1967. And the Marine Corps is kind of different than most organizations. They've been doing this since World War II, but there's something called staging battalion. That's 2 weeks at Camp Pendleton just prior to leaving the States to go to Vietnam. And they had a village set up, and they taught us counterinsurgency measures and guerrilla warfare and all that. And they've been doing that since World War II for the troops deploying. We didn't call it deploying in those days. It was just going to Vietnam.
Going to Vietnam. So you pulled that course, and how did you go to Vietnam, and where did you land?
You see, well, in those days, we were sending replacements to Vietnam one at a time. So I boarded the jet with the golden tail at El Toro. I was 19 years old when I got on the aircraft, and a few hours later it was midnight and I turned 20. So I had a birthday in the air, and then a few hours after that we passed the international date line, and it was the next day. So I had like a 4 or 6 hour birthday, so I tried not to think that that was a bad omen. But we landed in Okinawa, and Okinawa is another set of staging barracks where you just sit around and you get all your shots, you get all your utilities and everything you need.
And they lose your duffel bag.
Yes, right, right. And then eventually you're ushered into a room. It's good news, you're leaving for Vietnam tomorrow. Got my flight assigned. Now I had met up with 4 or 5 guys in staging battalion that were also crew chiefs. And so we were all hoping we'd get assigned to the same squadron. And so we flew from Fatima, or Camp Hansen, I think it was, in Okinawa, directly to Da Nang. And standing at the doorway and feeling the air on your skin for the first time, it had a texture to it. It felt like I could almost swallow the air. It was so thick. Of course, the smells were something you had no idea what it was consisted of, but you didn't really want to know either.
You hope not to find out.
Right. But it was, Da Nang was a major military base, and lots of noise, lots of vehicles going every direction. And I remember it was so hot. Standing at the top of those stairs, I looked down the runway and I could see the heat waves cooking off the deck, and it seemed like that was a great welcome. It was
now you
cool.
didn't have an assignment, so you got to go to the repo depot, and they're going to parcel you out.
No, they ushered us to a tent area. We filled out more paperwork, and I think within 24 hours they called my name, and some master sergeant was standing there and said, "Go to Khe Sanh and join your squadron, HMM 262." So it was my sister squadron from North Carolina, and several of us crew chiefs got the same assignment. So we were all new kids showing up at the same time. But we went to Chu Lai in July looking for Khe Sanh. Finally found Khe Sanh, and we reported.
Khe Sanh?
Khe Sanh is a small military base right on the water outside of Chu Lai, where our squadron was supposed to be located. We get there and it's not there. And somebody said, "No, they're in Marble Mountain, where we just were."
Where you just were.
Yeah, so we caught a leaking CH-34 and went back and joined the squadron, because a lot of us knew our squadron mates from 262. It was like old home week.
Yeah.
So it was good to join those guys.
Now, how quick did they put you on flight duty?
It took a while because, in the Marine Corps' wisdom, some senior NCO decided that he was going to assign crew chief positions in alphabetical order. And so some of these guys weren't even qualified crew chiefs that got put in. And so I was very upset about it. I'm sure I didn't help my career much by letting the staff know that I thought that was about the most asinine way to assign crew chiefs I'd ever heard. So I had to work my way into it. But it was a couple of months before I got flight orders.
And what'd you do during those 2 months? Paint rocks?
Taking care of aircraft, fixing leaks, and learning the whole process. And I did learn that it was a good squadron. It was, the commanding officer was a former private on Iwo Jima at 19 years old, and he spent all 5 weeks there. His name was Bill Shadrick, and he was a lieutenant colonel in charge of our squadron. He was just an amazing guy.
And your primary bird was the CH-46?
Yes, yes. Yeah, we didn't have anything such as composite squadrons where you had multiple aircraft in the squadron at that time.
Yeah.
It was all CH-46. We had 30 aircraft.
What were living conditions like?
In Da Nang, they were pretty decent. You know, we had hooches, so we could stay dry, and sand was everywhere, of course. I swore I'd never go to the beach again, but that was a lie.
Yeah.
But sand, you lived in sand, and sand got into absolutely everything. But the mess hall was good. In fact, the mess hall was even air conditioned, which I thought was amazing.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Hot shower?
Hot showers.
Wow. Describe your friendships with and your impressions of the Marines that you were living and working with.
Oh, they're the finest people on the face of the earth. You know, someone said it's always good to remember people when you were young because they remember you when you were at your best. And I think that's true. We get together every year. We didn't get together for almost 30 years, but with the invention of the internet, we all started typing in the name of our squadron, and eventually in 1997, we met in Las Vegas for the first time. It's like 20 of us showed up there, and it was an incredible thing as I kept seeing these old men as 20-year-old kids. I look them in the eye and remember them as they were.
As they were.
But, you know, we did some incredible things as young people, and it's really why I wrote my book, is I was at one of these reunions and I was looking around at these old guys and with their wives, and their wives had absolutely no idea what was asked of these basic kids, co-pilots who are 22, 23 years old, right out of college, and all of a sudden they're flying combat missions, extreme combat missions.
Did you form friendships with men from different racial and social backgrounds?
Oh, yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. We don't slice and dice each other up. You know, you're just all brothers.
Yeah.
And in your downtime, you sit around and you talk about your families and your backgrounds. And I had a friend from South Chicago who grew up in a pretty tough neighborhood, and he was a good guy, and I never would have met him had I not joined the Marine Corps.
Yeah. Now back home, there's racial tension and anti-war protests and all kinds of stuff going on. Does any of that come over to where you are?
It did in April of 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed. There was a definite shift, a standoffishness from my black brothers that just, you know, rightfully so, they were suspicious of everybody that had gone through this psychological tragedy. But I noticed it. You know, you just kind of talk through it and continue being brothers.
Yeah. What'd you guys do for recreation, off-duty time, if you had much of that?
Didn't have any of that. It was reading and writing letters home.
That was it.
Family, and I got really good at writing letters home because there wasn't much else to do. Joined the Book of the Month Club, and we all traded books. And
do you have specific memories of the popular culture of that time? And here I'm really talking music, where you hear a song on the oldies station and it takes you right back.
Oh yeah, but unfortunately our only pipeline to, what was happening in the States was through Armed Forces Radio.
Yeah.
And so they had a very restrictive playlist. So, but there's always that one guy, whether it's in your neighborhood or in your squadron, who's an audiophile, and he has tapes and he has all the latest music.
Got the latest Sony tape deck.
Yes. And so there was always that guy that would keep us up to date and would play songs that would never be on Armed Forces Radio, like Jefferson Starship or Jefferson Airplane at that time and some of that. But I did get letters from home from friends saying, Craig, you're missing out. Says there's this incredible invention that just happened and it's everywhere. And like, what is that? And you get mini skirts. So I remember receiving a very descriptive letter about the benefits of mini skirts.
Yeah, well, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll is happening back home, and what are you doing?
Yeah, it happened in 1 year. I was a kid who had a lot of freedom as a child because my parents both worked. And so I knew what was going on in the streets. When I left in 1967 to go to Vietnam, all my friends had short hair and military-type haircuts. I came back a year later, and they were all long-haired hippies and college students. So it was a culture shock for sure.
1 year.
In one
made
year,
a difference.
one short year. Of course, it was California, so that was kind of the tip of the spear right there.
Exactly.
The hippie movement.
Can you describe for us the quality of the leadership in your outfit, as high as you could see it?
Yeah, well, I tried not to be too overly critical, but there were, as far as the guys that were in my squadron, they were top of the line. They were just incredible in terms of keeping everybody focused because we were going through very difficult times, losing a lot of aircraft and a lot of men. So they kept us focused on what was important and kept the morale up by having lots of barbecues and commingling of the enlisted with the officers. And so they did a great job, but some of the decisions the generals were making I had a problem with. For an example, we were taking dead and wounded off the hills surrounding Khe Sanh. Instead of flying them directly to Dong Ha, which is about a 15-minute flight, a general decided, well, we've got a medical facility there at Khe Sanh. Well, Khe Sanh was getting 1,300 rounds of incoming a day.
They wanted you to medevac to Khe Sanh?
Constantly. So
that's crazy.
This poor guy who was wounded on one of the hills, all right, I'm going to get off of here. But he didn't realize he had 7 or 8 more chances to die.
Yeah.
One is that he's in a hole and he's safe and the corpsman's with him. And now they call for a CH-46 to come and pick him up. And so those are mortar magnets. So as soon as we started approaching the zone, there was rockets and mortars and small arms fire, automatic weapons fire. He'd have to crawl out of his hole and get to the aircraft without getting killed. And then we would lift off low and slow and just get hammered and then repeat the same thing on the way to Khe Sanh. As you start approaching Khe Sanh, the NVA mortars spotters knew exactly where Charlie Med was, so they knew where our helicopter was going. So they just timed their mortar and rocket attacks for our set down at Charlie Med. So now he's got another chance to die as we're approaching Charlie Med.
That makes no sense at all.
No, so I questioned that, and it took us forever to stop flying guys off of those hills to Charlie Med.
Into more combat.
Yes.
Instead of a safe place.
Right.
Whoa. Talk about your most vivid memories of your tour in Vietnam. Describe for us the best day you had during that tour.
The best day of my life was when somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, you've got orders home tomorrow." So that was by far the best day. And of course, the night before you're leaving, you know, you've spent 13 months creating a fantasy in your mind of what it's going to be like when you get back home. And you're like a 8 or 9 year old kid the day before Disneyland. You know, you can't sleep. And so that was by far the best.
Describe for us the worst day you had during your tour.
Worst day was on 28th February 1968. One of our aircrafts was shot down on the way to Khe Sanh. 22 Marines were killed on our aircraft. It caught on fire and burned up before it could hit the ground. And you know, going out on the missions to pick those guys up was the hardest thing I ever had to do.
Oh my.
Doesn't get harder than that.
No.
Because, you know, some of these guys I was with since boot camp. You know, and
there was somebody in your squadron.
Yeah, it was our squadron aircraft that was shot down. Made the national news. I had immediately fired off letters home to let my parents know I was okay, because I had no idea whether. I remember our commanding officer, to his credit, calling us together and say, "Write letters home because this is going to be on the news, and they may name our squadron." So I did that.
Describe any cutting-edge technology or science advancements that you saw or employed in Vietnam?
Yeah, we had an interesting mission up at Khe Sanh. The Air Force had developed, we had no idea what this stuff was, but the Air Force had developed sonic sensors, and they looked like artillery rounds. And so we picked up a technician, and we had a flight map that we were covering certain approaches to Khe Sanh, and these technicians would toss these sensors overboard, and they would embed in the jungle right next to these trails that the NVA used. And these sensors actually could pick up feet movement, troop movements, and they could tell based upon the rhythms on how many people were walking along that trail. So that was my only exposure to high tech, other than the incredible amount of high tech they have for killing people.
Yeah. Those sonic things seem to work pretty good.
Well, that's like in the Marine Corps, you never get the results. You just, you're flying
see
a particular
it deployed.
mission.
Right. That's it.
Right. But I read years later that they considered them, you know, important, because at that time the only intelligence gathering ability we had, because we didn't have satellite technology or infrared technology, was 8-man recon teams,
right.
That was the bane of our existence, flying emergency recon extractions, where an 8-man team is running for their life, probably carrying their wounded and dead with them, with 100 NVA chasing them, and then they would call us to go pick them up.
Come get us quick.
Yeah. So we lost a lot of aircraft doing that. But that was the primary way for military command to know what the NVA were doing at that time.
Good old SOG teams.
Yes. Just 18-year-old kids out there. We'd drop them off in triple canopy jungle, and they'd be assigned 4 or 5 day stints, and many times they'd get extended, which mean they didn't have enough rations and water, food, and they'd invariably be found because the NVA got better and better at counter recon measures. And they knew the CH-46 would be coming to pick them up, and the CH-46 is 85 feet long, rotor blade to rotor blade, and there's only so many LZs in that NVA's territory, so they had all those LZs completely zeroed in with rockets and mortars. So they just waited for the recon team to show up at one of them and call us in.
Sooner or later they'll turn up.
Yeah.
How much, if any, contact did you have with our allies in that war? The Koreans, the Australians, the Filipinos, the Thais?
The Korean Marines were hugely respected by Marines. They were just
seriously
tough
badass.
Guys. Tough guys. For an example, we would land in a Marine zone, and we'd be dumping out sea rations. Well, Marines would line up single file, and they'd take one case of sea rations and saunter over. In the meantime, we're waiting for rockets and mortars to come in. No sense of urgency. Where the Koreans, they would line up, and they would turn their back to the aircraft, and you'd just keep piling on sea rations until they said stop. And they would get 4 or 5 cases of sea rations and run. And then come back. I mean, they were highly motivated and very, very skilled, hard combat warriors. We thought the world of them.
Yeah.
So we'd do anything for those guys.
Yeah. What were your impressions of the Vietnamese people that you had anything to do with? Villagers, townspeople, ARVN, soldiers?
In Marine Corps flight operations, you have minimal contact. We had Mama-Sans who would come on base, and they would, sweep out the hooches and
wash your clothes.
Yeah, and maybe tend to the shitters. So there was minimal contact with those guys. The military, the ARVNs, we didn't have much respect for whatsoever. In fact, a good friend of mine who was severely wounded and evacuated, he was a crew chief, and he had gone in and picked up some ARVNs and transferred them a short way to Khe Sanh. And when they got off the aircraft, we were trained to make sure you check, because they'll leave ordnance around. And sure enough, they had left a grenade with a pin pulled stuck between the seats, and Peachy Keen was his name. And he found it and picked it up and walked up to the pilot and said, "I have this live grenade. What do you want me to do with it?" Just toss it over the side. So, but yeah, we didn't have much respect for those guys. We knew not to turn our backs on them.
That was a booby trap.
It was a booby trap, yeah.
Vibration would have shaken it loose.
So, his mom and dad were probably VC and brothers and all that, so whoever left that booby trap was not our friend.
Not our friend. How much contact did you have with your family back home?
The only contact we had was in writing letters, and as I said earlier, we all got really good at writing letters. I had a journal that I addressed my journal entries to Dear Mom, so I could say things in my journal that I couldn't say writing letters home. But there was a free flow of information. And unlike being a grunt in the field, I mean, we had mail service that was incredible. My mother would write a letter on a Monday, and I'd have it by Friday.
Wow.
And unless there was food associated to a package, then it seemed like it took forever to get there. In fact, I kept writing letters, send food, and she would always send cookies and candy and things like that, and I'd say, no, send food. And so when I got home and I said, how come you'd never send me food? And she goes, well, you were in the Marine Corps. I thought surely they'd be feeding you. Yeah, but it's, pretty
There's a
blasé
difference,
chow.
yeah. Now, you flew 77 days of missions into and around Khe Sanh.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about that.
Well, I'd felt that I had two different Vietnam experiences, one before January 68 and one after January 68. On January 10th, 1968, my squadron, 262, the Flying Tigers, we relocated to a small Marine base called Quang Tri, just south of Dong Ha. It was the northernmost helicopter base, Marine helicopter base in I Corps. And there was an extreme shortage of transport helicopters. And the moment we touched down, it was like nobody had to tell us that this was a different war. In early parts of '67, or in the summer to the fall to the winter, there were times you would fly for 3 or 4 weeks and never take rounds. The moment we landed at Quang Tri and started flying missions, just lifting off the ground, we would take incoming. And we went from 1,000 rounds per gun to 2,000 rounds, and then some crew chiefs went up to 4,000 rounds per gun because we needed it.
Yeah.
And but we were fat, dumb, and happy when we landed there. I mean, we were the base was extremely primitive. They didn't have bunkers built. We were living in World War II canvas tents. And the first order of business, CO ordered us officers and men to start building bunkers. Thank God we did, because 2 weeks later, our base was under continual barrage with rockets, mortars, and artillery when the Tet Offensive started. But we immediately started flying up to this place called Khe Sanh. And when we first got there, it was hot and muggy at Quang Tri, and then up at Quang Tri, you'd land at Quang Tri, and it was beautiful. It was nice and cool, and when the visibility was good, it was gorgeous. It looked like paradise. So we actually enjoyed the 2-day stints that we were sent up there. But shortly thereafter, on the 21st, just 11 days after we had landed at Quang Tri, the 77-day siege started. What we didn't know is that there were between 20 and 30,000 North Vietnamese troops that had moved into the Khe Sanh area, and they had spent weeks zeroing in every landing zone and every hill position with rockets and mortars and artillery. So they effectively turned every hilltop position into kill zones. And of course, they knew where Charlie Med was at Khe Sanh. The approach for the fixed-wing aircraft at Khe Sanh, they were very, very good at what they did. And one of the division was the 304th, which had laid siege to Dien Bien Phu during the fight with the French. So they were an elite division who had mortar teams that were some of the best in the world.
Yeah.
They learned a lot of lessons from Dien Bien Phu. For an example, they would light fires at night. They'd pick an area that they wanted to build a bunker complex, and they would light a fire. And sure enough, Marine Corps artillery would oblige them and blow 30-foot holes in the ground.
Dig holes for them.
And next morning, they'd have bunker complexes able to withstand B-52 strikes. So and I suspect they learned that from the French, fighting the French. But it was a shock to our system. I had been in combat for 6 months, so I was pretty salty, but half of our pilots and half of our flight crews had never heard a shot fired in anger when we landed at Quang Tri. And Imagine you're a 22-year-old co-pilot. It doesn't have much to do except monitor the radios. And you arrive on station at 881 South, and you look down from 1,000 feet, and all you see are tracers going everywhere and puffs of brown smoke from the mortars. And you go, oh my God, we're going to go down into that?
Pucker factor goes way
Yeah,
up.
right. Actually, I felt many times when we were flying missions we'd go up to Dong Ha and pick up external loads of ammo and water, and we'd fly from Dong Ha up to Khe Sanh, and I had a real sense of kinship with the World War II bomber crews that must have felt that anxiety, that knot in the stomach, knowing they were going into Germany with fighter pilots and flak. I felt the same way flying into 881 or 861. It was just, it was a bad situation because the North Vietnamese mortar crews, for example, they had something called the Iron Cross, and they would try to time where aircraft sat down. They'd have 5 mortars in the air. One hit in front of the aircraft, one in the back, one left and right, and one dead center. And so if your timing as a crew was at the same time as those mortars, you were dead. There's no way to avoid it. We lost 6 aircraft in the first couple of weeks of flying missions up there to the hills, and eventually we lost half of our aircraft, 15 aircraft in 40 days, and 21 men killed. So it was, I thought I knew what combat was, but once the Khe Sanh mission started, it was a whole different world.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the intensity of the missions, it was the fact that the dead and wounded never stopped. You know, every time you sat down in the zone, you lowered that ramp, you never knew what kind of hell was coming through that aft ramp. Young kids calling for their moms because they knew they were dying, and it just never stopped. It was every single day, every mission. It stretched my emotions to the point of breaking, to where you just go, I don't know how that I can continue doing this.
How many flights or missions were you doing a day? Were you flying from can't see to can't see, or?
No, we'd launch first thing in the morning at first light, and we wouldn't get back until almost dusk. Sometimes we were flying 12 and 14-hour days. With every 2 hours, you'd have to stop and refuel, hot refuel somewhere. But it was just continued because there wasn't enough Marine helicopter resources. We were overwhelmed. The Huey gunships was, our primary support was from a squadron called VMO6, and those guys were losing aircraft because their job was to get on station, find out where the NVA were, and then roll in on them with gunships. And to find where they were, they had to fly low and make themselves targets, and so they were losing a lot of aircraft. So there would be many times when our pilots would have to make a decision, particularly with the recon team. That was the most difficult, where 8-man recon team would be running for their lives with dead and wounded in tow, and they would get somewhere and the NVA would be on top of them, and we would arrive on station and our pilot would have to make a decision. Do I wait for gunships and run the risk of losing the team, or do I go now and run the risk of losing my entire crew and the aircraft?
Mm.
And these guys are making these decisions as 23, 24-year-old kids every single day, and having to live with the results.
Describe for us your return home.
Oh, it was a big celebration in the family. I come from a big family, so my aunt and uncle had met me at the airport, the local airport in Bakersfield, and my parents were on vacation somewhere. They didn't even know I was coming home that day. I didn't have a firm rotation date until 24 hours before they told me I was heading home.
When you came into LAX, or?
No, I flew into San Francisco from Vietnam.
How was that experience at the airport?
Well, I got into a cab immediately. I didn't have any of those experiences of people hurling, insults or spitting on me or anything like that. I think it was just total indifference. I was in uniform. Got into a taxi cab, and the guy was an ex-World War II veteran, so he was appreciative, and so that was good. So then I wound up catching another flight from another local airport to Bakersfield, because it's a small little
commuter line.
Yeah. So anyway, so when I finally got home, there was this big party. I was the prodigal son coming home, the fatted calf, and it was a big party, and all my friends were there, and it was a great celebration. Of course, nobody really knew what to say, or so we didn't really talk about Vietnam much. It was just time to catch up on everybody's lives and how they were doing.
Were you done with the Marine Corps? You still
No, I
owed
had
them
a
time?
year left to do, so they assigned me to Santa Ana Naval Air Station, which they called it LTA. It had those big giant blimp hangars.
Oh yeah,
So
been on that post.
yeah, so I commuted back and forth from Bakersfield to Santa Ana for a year, and then I got out. But the big shock for me was going to college parties with all my friends. Like I said, everybody had long hair, and I'd go to this party, and a hush would go over the room because I looked like I'd just been dropped off from the dark side of the moon. My eyes were sunken in the back of my head. I had no hair, and it was obvious I wasn't one of them, so I felt like the enemy within.
Hey. Did you have difficulty readjusting to life after combat?
Well, I didn't get a haircut for 3 years.
Yeah.
And I changed my major every time the wind changed. I wouldn't say that I had difficulties adjusting. It was just, a new phase of life, and put my nose to the grindstone and tried to be successful in whatever it was I was doing.
You went back to college.
Yes.
What did you end up majoring in?
Well, I was pre-vet medicine major for a while. Then I was in journalism, and then I finally settled on business sensibly. And I had a biology teacher who, the first day in class, he said, "Okay, I'm going to give 50 extra points every week to the student who knows the magic number." Well, he and I had talked, and I knew he was a reserve Marine officer, so I knew what the magic number was. In those days, every Sunday night or Sunday in the newspaper, they'd publish how many Marine men were killed in Vietnam. So that became the magic number, and that kind of gave me an edge for a while. But I thought that was interesting, that he was wanting his young students to be totally aware of, the sacrifices that were happening.
Have you stayed in touch with guys you flew with back then?
Yeah,
over
it was.
the years.
It was. Well, there was one. My best friend there. He and I had always traded letters and Christmas cards and all that stuff, but that was it. Just one guy. And then 30 years later, with the invention of the internet, we all started looking for each other. And so we've been getting together once a year as a reunion somewhere in the U.S. And it's good to see these guys. because as I was invited to speak with a group of pilots in Nashville in October, and so we were sending out questionnaires on what everybody wanted to talk about, and one of the pilots said, "Look, we know what we did. We don't really need to talk about it." So I think we all pretty much felt like that. We know what we did, but nobody else knew, so that's why I wrote my book.
There it is. Did your Vietnam experience change you and affect your life afterward, for good or for bad, or somewhere in
Oh, it
between?
absolutely affects you. You're not the same person when you come back. Someone said that everything I am today flows back to the time I was in combat, and I can relate to that. I think my family sees that, is that you cannot go through days and days and days of combat and not have it affect you in any way. It's just impossible to do that. It changes your perspective. I was in sales for 30 years, and we would have these big sales meetings. We'd have to get up and give presentations to the owners of the company and these big wigs in the organization, and all my counterparts would be all nervous and shaking about it. And I said, "Look, I woke up this morning and nobody was shooting at me. It's a good day.
It's a good day.
Don't worry about it." So it definitely colors your life. But it could be that young corporal that told me, "Stay calm in all situations."
Stay calm.
Yeah.
Did your experience in Vietnam affect the way you think about troops coming back from today's wars?
Yes. The older I get, the more emotional I am about that. It's because I know what they went through.
The idea that they go through 8 or 10, 12 deployments
Yes.
to combat is
Right.
beyond my understanding.
I don't know how they do it, and the way they communicate with their families today, with video conferencing and stuff like that, I would think that would be so much harder to have a conversation with your pregnant wife and then go out on a deployment.
Right.
How they, wrap their minds around that. Where our communication was strictly remote via letters, there it's up close and personal, and your family has a real life, and then your job is just to stay alive and keep your comrades alive. So it's just the opposite end of the spectrum, and how they juggle that, I don't know.
Yeah, and if they get a KIA in the unit,
Yeah.
they have to shut off all comms.
Yeah.
Till the family is notified.
Right.
Because
everybody
is gossiping.
Right.
They can't have that.
Yeah, so I always make a point of, when I was traveling quite a bit for business, if I saw anybody in uniform, I always walked over and gave them $20 and could have lunch on me. I've been, if I were upgraded to first class and there were grunts on board, I'd pick out one and have them take my seat. I just think that's important that these guys understand that we appreciate it. Of course, we didn't have any of that. We just came back and we were ignored.
How do you think the Vietnam War is remembered in our society today?
I think it's remembered as a defeat and divisive event. A lot of people think it was a racist thing to do, and has nothing to, in their minds, it had nothing to do with protecting an ally and trying to help them develop a democratic society. They see it as a tragedy of 58,000 men lost. And it's hard not to feel that tragedy as well as a combat veteran. Especially when I was flying missions at Khe Sanh and we were bringing so many dead and wounded Marines on board our aircraft. And then in June of 1968, I flew over the base and they were in the process of blowing it up. The CBs were removing all evidence that a base had been there. And for me, it was just a glimpse of what the country was going to wind up doing to South Vietnam, is just pulling up stakes and leaving. But I can't imagine a parent who lost a child at Khe Sanh and then we just abandon the base and walk away from it. That was just...
We reopened it in 71 for the invasion of Laos.
Right, and then we closed it again.
Then closed it again.
Yeah.
But
right.
it was eerie.
Yes.
They were bulldozed heaps of aircraft and tanks and junk out in the jungle.
Yes.
And I walked from Arvin headquarters on a hill about 2 miles from the airstrip down this red dirt road, and the trees on either side were all dead.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Well, I have pictures in my book that shows this former triple canopy jungle. It looks like a moonscape.
Yeah.
You know, with nothing but craters, and you couldn't have gone on that walk in 1968. I guarantee it.
Oh, I'd have been killed.
Yeah.
I was worried about that. I was walking it with one other reporter.
Right.
We had to get back to the strip before dark because the Americans left at night.
Yeah.
Went back to Quang Tri.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Mm-hmm.
Are there lessons you took from your service in Vietnam that you would like to pass on to a new generation?
Yes. Train your mind to stay calm in all circumstances, because that's your greatest chance of surviving no matter what the situation is, whether it's in business or your personal life. And the one lesson closest to my heart is that say thank you to your soldiers and warriors.
Have you visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial here?
Yes.
What are your thoughts when you go there?
Yeah, emotionally it was overwhelming because we had 21 guys in one section that all died together. We wound up having a memorial. We had the Navy chaplain. He was the #1 chaplain for the Navy. He came. In 2001, just before 9/11, we had a memorial at the service as a squadron, and one of our former pilots is the three-star General Fred McCorkle, and he arranged a 2 CH-46 flyover, and that was just overwhelming. To be standing there in front of the wall, and then the whop, whop, whop of those aircraft.
They came.
They flew over at low level, and that was a tremendous feeling. We also had over 100 next of kin with us at that service.
Wow.
And we had a ceremony, and we gave the moms a silver rose, long stem rose. It was a little ceremony, and it was, we did it right at the wall. So when I go to the wall now, I think of that day. But I think that, you know, initially there was all this controversy about whether it was an appropriate memorial, and I say yes. You know, the fact that on the left side, it's the first casualty, and it goes up to the height of the war, and then down to the last guy who's dead. And the granite wall where you can see yourself in the reflection. I think it was totally appropriate.
You've heard about the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War commemoration. You're part of it today.
Yes, I have a pen.
I see you're wearing your
That was
lapel
given
pin.
to me by Colonel Ron Gatewood, and he had copies of the proclamation.
Right.
Handed those out. Yes, I think it's a tremendous thing y'all are doing, and I really appreciate it.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you you'd like to say?
No, I don't think so. I think it's, everything is kind of in a swirl right now.
Well, thank you for coming up.
Thank you, Joe, very much.
Sharing
I
your
appreciate
story.
it.
We really
Pleasure to
appreciate-
meet you.
Well, my pleasure entirely.